Hi, thanks everyone for coming. I sent a Twitter yesterday saying my worst fear every conference is that I talk to a room of empty seats. So thank you, each and every one of you, for being here. It's nice to be back in Paris. This was actually my hometown for 12 years. I had some kids here. Does anyone have kids? Oh, nice. If you guys celebrate Christmas, do they still believe in Santa Claus? Yeah? Oh, I see some yes? Oh, nice. Say it again? Just about? Okay. I have two kids. One is already a teenager. The other one is practically a teenager. And when they were young, they asked me about Santa. And I'm a good parent, so I told them the truth. I said, "You're looking at him." And even though I told them flat out that there's no Santa Claus, they still kind of wanted to believe in him. The idea of Santa Claus changed their behavior. The shared myth of Santa made such a strong impression on my kids, a jolly old man with a bag full of toys, that it changed their behaviors. When I was a kid, New York City started a recycling program. This was the late 80s, and I think a lot of people in this room might not have even been born. And my mom made us separate paper, plastic, glass, even aluminum cans. And it made us feel like we were doing something good for the world. Our shared myth was that the city was actually going to do something with our recyclables, that what we recycled would go back on the product shelves, and that we would buy things and we wouldn't waste. That story changed the behavior of 7 million New Yorkers, including us. But the reality was that New York has, and still, sends an overwhelming majority of their waste to landfills and incinerators, and even the recyclables that we carefully washed and separated are sent to landfills and incinerators. Even now, after 3 decades of that program, only 20% of New York City's waste is recycled. And from those recyclables, over 50% still goes to the same place as regular waste, or it's dumped on poorer countries by waste brokers. What we believed we were recycling was actually just being exported to other countries to deal with. A startling fact is that up until 2017, when a government ban prohibited it, China had been importing over 50% of the world's plastic waste. This is an image from the 2016 documentary, Plastics China, which follows an 11-year-old girl and her family living and working in a recycling plant in China. It tells us the story now of what actually happened to the plastics we washed and separated. We have to acknowledge that recycling is important, but it alone does not solve the problem it meant to address. Negative externalities creates new social and planetary harms. What if instead the narrative 30 years ago affected our behaviors in different ways? What if, instead of making us wash and separate, it made us use and consume less? Ours is the only species that tells stories. Bears don't stand around laughing their heads off about chasing campers up trees. Stories are ways for us to entertain each other, to make each other laugh, to make each other cry, to make each other feel, and most importantly, to change our behaviors. Because myths, a specific type of story, reinforce cultural values. And this distinguishes us from other animals. Myths serve an important purpose. We wouldn't be here right now without them. This is a great quote from Harari. Because Homo sapiens' shared myths were not genetically based, they could adapt and change their behavior as soon as they adapted their new belief. They didn't have to wait millions of years for a genetic change. Because the overarching thesis in his book, Sapiens, is that human access is based on shared myths. Human success is based on shared myths. Because they hold great power and they sway collective behavior. Because they allow humans to cooperate in multiple ways and with countless number of strangers. The world we're living in right now has been shaped by centuries of collective myths. Myths about biblical creation, democracy, human rights, and money. When we decide to change our collective myths, we change behavior quickly and drastically. Some simple examples. Monarchy was declared an outdated form of governance. Think about that. Monarchies existed as far back as ancient pharaohs. Women were declared to have the same rights as men, reversing a long-standing pattern. And slavery, one of the oldest institutions in human history, was deemed unacceptable. Now, that's not to say that forms of modern slavery don't exist, because they do, but this kind of slave trade, depicted in this map of trade from 1500 to 1900, no longer does. Our shared myths affect our behavior. Speaking of behaviors, economics is a social science rooted in human behavior, unlike natural sciences, which couldn't care less about humans. Natural science laws describe universal and fundamental truths based on empirical evidence, such as the law of gravity. In contrast, economic laws are based on models and assumptions. They describe patterns and trends in human behavior rather than unchanging truths. For example, the supply of law and demand, and the law of diminishing marginal utility. As a person consumes an item or product, their satisfaction declines as each additional unit is consumed. This is not an empirical truth. Economics studies the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Goods and services produced by humans, distributed by humans, and consumed by humans. And yet, economists still study events by looking almost exclusively at changes in economic aggregates. Aggregations like the GDP, wage rates, unemployment, interest rates. Robert Shiller is an economist who developed narrative economics. He makes this point, that looking at economic aggregates alone does not lead to meaningful understandings, and it can even be harmful. He says, if we do not understand the epidemics of popular narratives, we do not fully understand changes in the economy and economic behavior. Schiller's work is significant because it extends our understanding of economics beyond numbers and models. It factors in the human element, human behaviors, and the important role of narratives. Our shared myths affect our behaviors, and behaviors affect our economies. And what does our economies affect? Does anyone want to throw out some ideas? No? Okay. Planetary and social outcomes. By which we mean this planet and all living things that depend on it. Does anyone here think that our current economic systems are producing healthy social or planetary outcomes? No, I see a lot of heads shaking. Anyone want to say yes? No, good, okay. No, it seems as if they're both increasingly worse off. Current economic systems are producing harmful social and planetary outcomes, and we can do better. To achieve better outcomes, we need better collective myths. Our world is still running on outdated 20th century myths. Myths like the Church of Economic Growth. That is, this belief, with a religious-like fervor, that continuous economic growth is inherently good, necessary, and a key indicator of progress. Just look at these recent headlines. They all spell out a clear message. Growth equals good, decline equals bad. The story goes, our justice, freedom, and happiness requires economic growth. Growth is portrayed as the solution to all of our problems. Everything depends on number go up. A renegade economist, Herman Daly, developed something called ecological economics, and he points out the fallacy of perpetual economic growth. He says that growth is widely thought to be the panacea for all our economic ills in our modern world. Poverty? Just grow the economy. Increase the production of supplies and goods. Spur consumer spending. Now watch the wealth trickle down. Unemployment? Increase demand for goods and services, lower interest rates, stimulate investments, and this will lead to more jobs and more growth. Environmental degradation. Trust in the environmental Kuznets curve. This purports to show that with ongoing growth in GDP, pollution at first increases, but then it reaches a maximum and it declines. It sounds pretty incredible, right? Has anyone heard of the environmental Kuznets curve? Okay, I see some yeses. Okay, I haven't. So I looked it up. I thought it was incredible, and here it is, the environmental Kuznets curve. Maybe it's related to dumping waste on poorer countries to deal with. But I don't know, I'm not an economist. Herman Daly also introduced the concept of uneconomic growth, when growth costs more than it's actually worth. Through depletion from the biosphere and pollution back into the biosphere, uneconomic growth increases the products of bads rather than the products of goods. Kate Raworth. Is anyone familiar with this diagram? Okay, a lot of yeses. Kate Raworth is an economist who directly challenges the Church of Economic Growth mindset. She says, quite poignantly, today we have economies that need growth whether or not they make us thrive, when what we need are economies that make us thrive whether or not they grow. She developed an economic model she calls donut economics. The donut is comprised of two concentric rings, a social foundation that ensures no one falls short on life's essentials, and an ecological ceiling to ensure we don't overshoot planetary boundaries. She provides an economic framework that meets the needs of all people within the means of the planet. This is in stark contrast to focusing solely on GDP growth. Kate Raworth elaborates 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist. Here she proposes solutions for 2 of the outdated myths that we already looked at. Moving from growth addict to growth agnostic. Moving from growth will clean it up, remember the environmental Kuznets curve, to regenerative by design, by thinking in systems. And speaking of regenerative, John Fullerton developed a model for regenerative economics. The foundational premise is this, that the economy is not separate from the biosphere or the society in which it is embedded. He makes the point that we need to shift our economic systems from one that is extractive and exploitative to one that is regenerative and restorative. He derived 8 principles to move us in that direction. These principles include creating resilient and adaptive systems, valuing diversity and cooperation, and recognizing the interdependence of economic, social, and ecological systems. Both Raworth and Fullerton are building 21st century models upon which we begin to write the collective myths that affect our collective behaviors. Another 20th century myth, social Darwinism. The phrase survival of the fittest is misunderstood when fittest is interpreted to mean the strongest or most physically capable. As you can see by these definitions from dictionaries, the unfortunate misinterpretation is persistent even today. Fittest actually links back well to regenerative economics principles of in-right relationship and seeks balance. Being in the right relationship and in balance with the living systems in which we are a part of, fitting in. Those most well adapted to their environment will have the greatest reproductive success. It does not mean physical strength or size. It includes factors like intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. Ironically, Darwin was clear. He wrote, "Those communities which include the greatest number of most sympathetic members rear the greatest number of offspring." The Victorian concept of sympathy we might now call empathy or emotional intelligence, but not brawn or might or most successful. Darwin's insights about biology was intentionally misconstrued by contemporaries who created an ideology that came to be known as social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the myth that the most successful deserve their success and those who fail deserve their failures. Now let's talk about something close to my heart, the tragedy of the commons. The American ecologist Gareth Hardin penned an essay titled "Tragedy of the Commons" in 1968. That quippy little title embodies one of the most durable myths of past generations. He first describes a fenced-off, privately owned pasture. He describes this pasture as thriving and well-kept. Then he describes a common pasture, one that anyone can use. And he describes this pasture as battle-worn and devastated. He concludes that the owners have incentive to take care of their land, but humans will naturally exploit any resource freely available to them. Hardin argued strongly that only markets and states can solve social and environmental problems. He argued that individuals would always act in their own self-interest without regard for the collective good. Hardin's arguments were based on a false premise. The second pasture he was describing was, in fact, not a commons at all. It was an unmanaged, unprotected, absolute free-for-all. A commons requires a shared resource, such as the pasture land, but it also requires an active community, such as the land's adjacent farmers, and a set of rules that they create and enforce. A commons is a shared resource that is owned and managed collectively by a community. Rules are enforced by social pressures and cultural norms rather than formal laws and regulations. Commons-based management can be more effective and sustainable than private or public management because it takes into account the long-term interest of sustainability, the long-term interest of the community, and it promotes cooperation and trust. Enclosures of the commons, when private or public sectors claim exclusive ownership and control of a shared resource, have historically led to environmental degradation, social inequality, and the loss of traditional knowledge and practices. Are many people familiar with Elinor Ostrom and her work? Elinor Ostrom was a political scientist and economist, and until Ostrom, the tragedy of the commons was conventional wisdom. In her pioneering research, she examined how societies manage shared resources successfully without resorting to top-down command and control. And based on her extensive case studies, she underscored 8 design principles for governing commons. Among these principles are clearly defined boundaries, collective choice arrangements, monitoring, graduated sanctions, and conflict resolution mechanisms. The kind of principles you would expect when you have a group of humans who get together. Her work has a broad and significant impact on our understanding of resource management, economic development, and environmental sustainability. In 2009, she received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for her work. The official prize motivation read for her analysis of economic governance, especially the commons. In essence, she was recognized for proving, with empirical data, that humans can cooperate to effectively manage shared resources without government or private sector intervention. It was such an outlandish idea that She received a Nobel Prize for this. At Common Stack, we're building tooling and cultural frameworks that enable communities to build Web3 commons and practice commoning. These are the 4 pillars that represent our approach to funding, governance, and public good management. We do research, we build cultural frameworks, we build a library of tools, and we practice economics co-design. We see commons as a vital step toward truly regenerative systems in the future, and it's not just us. Earlier this year, in his regenerative economics course, John Fullerton shared a private view. He said, and I quote, "I've been thinking about this obviously for a very long time, and I don't know if it's possible to generally have a regenerative economy if we don't institutionalize the commons." Kate Rosworth asks to bring more attention to commons by speaking about them and pointing them out so people know that they exist. And Jason Potts, an economist and author of the book Innovation Commons, argues that the Innovation Commons is a unique institutional form that provides a framework for the creation and diffusion of knowledge and innovation. He talks about crypto as an Innovation Commons. It did not start out enclosed, it started out in the open, and so much of it remains open source. Up here are just some of the organizations that we've collaborated with, but there are countless others. Gitcoin and their Allo protocol, ENS, a critical public good, the Token Engineering Commons and the Token Engineering Academy, Regens Unite, and chains like Optimism, Cello, hundreds of more I don't have time to name. But this is why I'm talking about myths and behaviors and economics and planetary outcomes here at ETHCC. Look around you. Here are the builders of the tools and protocols, builders of the culture needed to replace outdated 20th century myths that run the world, like the Church of Economic Growth, social Darwinism, and tragedy of the commons, and replace them with ones that actually stand a chance to improve social and planetary outcomes, uneconomic growth, regenerative by design, by systems thinking, and institutionalization of the commons. Thank you. Let's build. I'm being told I have a few minutes. Are there any questions?
Thank you for that inspiring, great talk. So what does Common Stack do?
Thanks for that question. I know I didn't cover it clearly. I was really focused on the philosophy of why we're doing it. Common Stack builds cryptoeconomic primitives, does research on cryptoeconomic primitives, builds tools that allow communities to create commons DAOs, or to use tools that advance this idea of commoning. Livia in the audience is our lead for the cultural frameworks, and she builds the protocols and practices that apply Elinor Ostrom's principles of governing the commons into practices within communities. We just launched a new website, actually. I know I'm the first person to use our new branding, so there's a lot of more information on the website, and I encourage you to go to commons, with an S, stack.org, and check it out.
Thank you. I was curious about what do you think are the myths that we should debunk right now? Like, what are the myths that are ruling the world right now, or the main one, in your opinion, that we should go and we should build a different narrative for it?
Yeah, I think it really is the one that I focused on in here, this idea that we can grow without bounds forever. I think this idea of economic growth is leading us to a place where we're just accumulating more, consuming more, and trying to dig ourselves out of this bigger mess. And I think by building parallel structures that value things that are not profit, So not valuing the profit of something, but valuing something for its ecological value or its cultural value instead of its monetary value is one way that we can do that.
Thank you, Tamara. Awesome talk. I'm wondering, how could someone get involved with the Commons Stack?
I should have put something on my slide. I would say the easiest thing to do is DM us on Twitter. You can join our Discord server. All of this information will be on Commons Stack's website. Hop on our Telegram group. My DMs are open, so you can reach out to me personally. I actually really enjoy having conversations with people who are interested in Commons Stack and Commons and what we do, so please also reach out to me directly.
Thanks for the talk. What's the biggest use case? Is it like tokenizing open space or recycling or?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. The community that first used our design patterns, so we have augmented bonding curve, conviction voting, these kinds of tools that promote this commons mentality, was the token engineering community. And what we did with them in partnership was launch a token engineering commons. And the token engineering commons supports public goods for token engineering, that advanced token engineering. So education, like the Token Engineering Academy, research, like the Bonding Curve Research Group, the Token Engineering Stakeholder Study, and open source software. So they help support initiatives that contribute to the public goods of token engineering. So we can imagine any kind of community that wants to advance a movement, a UBI commons would be a great example, or plastics management commons that want to advocate, that want to gather attrition, become a Schelling point for that movement, and pool their resources together to make meaningful change rather than sporadic or dispersed communities trying to do it separately.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay then. Thanks. I hope you enjoy the rest of ECC.